The New World Order. The New World Order.
This is all a conspiracy. Don't you know that? It's a conspiracy.
Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. It is Monday, so it's time for the Sunday review of the mainstream media. Welcome once again to the podcast. So today, as usual, I'm going to tear into the Sunday New York Times, showing how the newspaper continually mischaracterizes the facts to mislead the public. But we're also going to hear from Anthony Fauci, who there was a segment on CBS Sunday Morning where they tried to push his book On Call and tried to resurrect his debilitated career, his whole career. CBS Sunday Morning Propaganda literally blew sunshine up our skirts regarding the criminal behavior of the so-called Dr. Mengele of America, Dr. Fauci, and pushed his new book that shows the doctor in a favorable light as he tries to resurrect his reputation. Now that the American public know he caused AIDS, he developed AZT, and he also developed the COVID vaccination and very likely the COVID virus itself. So let's just get right into that CBS Sunday Morning segment on Anthony Fauci.
When you have a virus, if you're going to manipulate it in a way to make it a dangerous virus.
People have accused you of, getting all sorts of money from pharma and this, that, and the other thing. You have been offered money.
A villain, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. John Libertarianism starts at the beginning.
So you had to settle for medicine.
So I said, let me just settle for science, whatever. That would get me $5, $6, $7 million a year. So,
in his new memoir, On Call, Dr. Fauci's career has been bookended by the two great pandemics of our time, AIDS and COVID-19.
Federal health officials consider it an epidemic, yet you rarely hear a thing about it.
What first widely appeared in the early 1980s, a diagnosis of HIV/AIDS was a death sentence. He established the NIH's Vaccine Research Center that laid the groundwork for the record-breaking development of COVID vaccines during the Trump administration.
President Trump had a press conference and he said, things have changed and the CDC is now recommending that people wear masks.
right.
And then he added,
This is voluntary. I don't think I'm going to be doing it.
I was deeply disturbed by that because masks are going to protect me and protect others.
As the country's willingness to follow public health advice largely split along party lines, Dr. Fauci came under attack.
Do the American people deserve to be abused like that, Mr. Fauci? Because you're not doctor, you're Mr. Fauci in my few minutes.
Earlier this month, Dr. Fauci was called before a Republican-led congressional committee to discuss pandemic origins and preparedness.
What this committee should be doing, we should be recommending you to be prosecuted.
One of the deepest points of controversy is the still unknown origin of SARS-CoV-2.
The media, you have been lying to the American people long enough.
Because the NIH has funded research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China.
What?
There are accusations that American tax dollars could have paid to create SARS-CoV-2 through genetic manipulation. It's called gain of function.
isn't really the issue behind all of this controversy that those coronaviruses, the ones that were funded by the NIH, were somehow fiddled with to turn it into the virus that causes COVID-19.
When you have a virus, if you're going to manipulate it in a way to make it a dangerous virus, the viruses that were studied under the NIH grant for the kinds of experiments that were done.
Right, which the public doesn't know that.
The public doesn't know what would take 20 years of evolution. What we're talking about is what the NIH funded. I keep an open mind as to what the origin is.
COVID origins aside, Dr. Fauci has been subjected to other accusations.
people have accused you of, getting all sorts of money from pharma and this, that, and the other thing. You have been offered money.
That would get me $5, $6, $7 million a year. So
Any regrets?
no. I mean, when you say regrets, any regrets of what I did, my choices, no.
What this committee should be doing, we should be recommending you to be prosecuted.
Yeah, the fact that he just goes on and on about how great he is and that he doesn't know where the origins of SARS-CoV-2 came from, even though he lied to the American public time and time again that the NIH funded research, and now he admits that they funded research at the Wuhan laboratory, which is in China, which is one of our ideological adversaries and actually one of our military enemies, that he did all this to get around moratoriums on that exact research that was taking place in the United States, and that he does work with pharma, and he's never disclosed the kind of kickbacks he receives from the pharmaceutical industry and that whole murkiness there. I'm going to take the time now to encourage you to engage the channel. I appreciate you coming by. Give me a thumbs up, share the podcast, leave a comment. And now I think we're going to get into the headlines from the Sunday New York Times. So the first article up today is the resistance to a new Trump administration has already started. An emerging coalition that views Donald J. Trump's agenda as a threat to democracy is laying the groundwork to push back if he wins in November, taking extraordinary preemptive action. Basically what this is that he's not a threat to democracy. He's a threat to the Democratic Party and their agenda, which is protecting the establishment while the establishment joins other left-wing, postmodern socialist groups around the world that are trying to push this new world post-human agenda. And I'm going to get into, there's some schisms because you have to realize also that the West nurtured China into the enemy it is today. And now there's a split going on. I'm going to explain that a little bit later. And also, I'm sorry I got the live stream up today. I'm trying to get it going on Rumble every day at 10 o'clock. Today it was like 10:30. I got a late start. And always on Monday, it's been a little later because I have to do a little more work before I go on, a little more production work before I go on. So let's get back into this article from the New York Times. The resistance to a new Trump administration has already started. So they basically, to be honest with you, they basically are already succumbed to the fact that Donald Trump likely will win. Now, they're trying to play with the poll numbers and what have you to suggest that Joe Biden or the Democrats still have a chance, but they're coming to terms with the fact that Trump may become president. So they're already getting groups ready to battle the Donald Trump administration before and after he's inaugurated. So I'm going to just get into the article very briefly here. Opponents of Donald Trump are drafting potential lawsuits in the case he is elected in November and carries out mass deportations as he vowed. Oh, no. Deporting illegal aliens, I guess, is a problem. One group has hired a new auditor to withstand any attempt by a second Donald Trump administration to unleash the Internal Revenue Service against them, like the Democratic Party has done against Republicans. Democrat-run state governments are even stockpiling abortion medications. I don't think he's really concerned about that. And after all, Donald Trump did say if Republicans want to win, they have to ease up on their abortion stance. Not from a moral standpoint, but definitely from a political standpoint, because most of the electorate want abortions to remain as a legal option, but with restrictions, obviously, because you don't want people to use abortion as birth control, et cetera, but I'm not going to digress too much into that. Getting back to this article, though, a sprawling network of Democratic officials. Now, listen to this. A sprawling network of Democratic officials, that means politicians and their staff, et cetera, and people hired by the DNC, Progressive activists who were controlled by the DNC, watchdog groups, which are NGOs that are funded through leftist donors and the DNC, and ex-Republicans, so anti-Trumpers, have been taking extraordinary steps to prepare for a potential second Trump presidency, drawn together by the fear that Mr. Trump's return to power would pose a grave threat, now listen to this, not to their agenda, not just to their agenda, but to American democracy itself. Now, what I want to go on to say here is that that's the point. Mr. Trump's return to power would pose a grave threat to their agenda, which is a postmodern New World Order agenda, a globalist agenda. So that's ending United States sovereignty. It's ending individual sovereignty. As much as they talk about democracy, they don't talk about your individual liberties, which they want to end also, because the globalist agenda can't, and the corporate global government can't take place when individuals have civil liberties, individual liberties that they could use to voice their opinion without consequence and or protect themselves against tyranny, Second Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just go on with this article. Interviews with more than 30 officials and leaders of organizations, so organizations meaning the DNC, about their plans revealed a combination of acute exhaustion and acute anxiety. Activist groups had spent the 4 years of Mr. Trump's presidency organizing, see, they were activist groups who were controlled by the DNC, spent 4 years organizing mass protests and pursuing. So they're just admitting that the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests were in fact against Trump. So Trump's presidency organizing mass protests and pursuing legal challenges, which means all the lawfare waged against him. So the New York Times there is admitting or glossing over the fact that groups, they just say groups, the DNC, leftist groups, NGOs, et cetera, that parlayed the gains by Organizing for America or Obama for America, the OFA, which basically took what Obama did during his candidacy and spread it worldwide. And then when people became wise of the OFA, it started splintering into other groups. But what these groups did is show activists how to protest effectively. Not only that, but how to cheat, steal, and riot, and all these other things. So the article goes on to say the group leaders say they have learned a lot from 2017 to 2021 about how to run effective resistance campaign. At the same time, their understanding of what Mr. Trump is capable of expanded after the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021. They believe the orbit around Mr. Trump has grown more sophisticated and that a second White House would be more radical and more effective, especially in the core issues like immigration. I just have to go on to say is that you can't be right-wing and radical. When you're on the conservative side, traditionalist side, the right, you're a reactionary. So what reactionaries do is react to radical progressives or progressive agendas, progressive politics, etc. So you can't, I know Webster has changed the definition to say you could be on the right or left and be radical. It's not. And the point they're making there at the end is saying that Trump is less naive this time than he was in 2016. He thought that he could cobble together a government with old school Republicans, but they were full of never Trumpers and were actually controlled opposition. They were on board with the whole corporate globalist state, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. Moving on to the next headline here from the Sunday New York Times. Trump lawyers argue barring attacks on Trump lawyers argue barring attacks on FBI would censor political speech, which indeed does, which is the most important type of speech, most protected type of speech. In a filing, the lawyers in the classified documents case made an aggressive and at times misleading, according to the New York Times, argument against prosecutors' request for the judge to curb his attacks on agents. And he wasn't really attacking agents. The league goes on to say lawyers for former President Donald Trump pushed back on Friday night in an aggressive and sometimes misleading way. So he said that in the subhead and now in the lead again. Like they always have to say claims or false claims in a misleading way against an effort to curb his public attacks on FBI agents working on his classified documents case. And before I get into that, I just want to say that it's not misleading. Okay, so the intelligence service of the FBI, which is the nation's secret police, they might as well be the Gestapo, and they are there to protect the establishment is exactly what they're doing. So I'm going to get back to the article here. In a 20-page court filing, the lawyers assailed prosecutors in the Office of Special Counsel Jack Smith for seeking to limit Mr. Trump's speech about the FBI on the eve of two consequential political events. The first presidential debate scheduled for June 27th and the Republican National Convention set to start July 15th. They go on to say the motion is a naked effort to impose totalitarian censorship of core political speech, indeed, under the threat of incarceration in a clear attempt to silence President Trump's arguments to the American people about the outrageous nature of this investigation. And it is outrageous. Because it's all trumped up charges. And the fact is what the FBI did at Mar-a-Lago, which was a document seizure, which, first of all, they didn't need to go in armed. They didn't need the authority to kill. And they certainly didn't need to go in and actually alter evidence. So purportedly what we understand is that those red cover pages that the FBI put on top of the stacks of documents and spread them all over the floor, which isn't an evidence shot. If you know anything about criminal investigations, when they go in and discover stuff, they're supposed to take photographs of how it was discovered. You don't move evidence around and display it on the floor and then take pictures. You could do that once they're seized and there's back at the investigative headquarters, but you don't do that on scene. Because that's altering evidence, and those pictures were leaked. And then the people that saw those pictures thought that that's how they discovered the documents were spread all over the floor, and with cover pages that weren't actually with those documents. In any case, going back to the story here, the distortions arose from a gross mischaracterization by the former president, indeed it was not, of a recently unsealed order for the Mar-a-Lago search that included boilerplate, and they keep saying boilerplate language intended to limit the use of deadly force when agents execute warrants. They say limit. That's not what it said. The boilerplate language, as they say, is said that they can use deadly force. Not to limit deadly force, that they can use deadly force if threatened. Now, what exactly does that mean? Now, also, you have to know the history of the FBI and how the FBI goes around shooting people and killing people, and a lot of times unarmed people, or shooting at unarmed people. It goes on and on, but I'm not going to go, not to mention that organizing criminal acts. So I'm not going to go on a tear on the FBI right now. We're going to try to stick to the story here at hand. The order, like hundreds of others issued by the FBI, instructed agents to use lethal force only in the case of extreme danger. It's not limiting. They said you may use lethal force when executing a warrant against a former president. Are you following? Executing a warrant against the former president at his home. You're entering the home of a former commander-in-chief, and you're given the green light if you feel you're in extreme danger, which is really boilerplate. It's just it's speculative or ambiguous in the case that how would you feel in danger? Like if someone tried to stop you from executing the warrant, would that be danger? But they authorized, they didn't, see the thing is, it's an authorization to use lethal force. They weren't instructed that if they use, that they could, only in the case of extreme danger. That's the mischaracterization that the New York Times uses. But Mr. Trump, the story goes on to say, and some of his allies flipped those limitations on their head, suggesting that agents had been given the green light to kill him when they descended on Mar-a-Lago. Well, he wasn't there. In their filing on Friday night, Mr. Trump's lawyer soft-pedaled his falsehood, saying they had merely criticized the Mar-a-Lago search in a manner that someone in the government disagreed with and does not like. Basically, what I'm saying is this was an extreme circumstance. This isn't the FBI going and executing a warrant at a drug dealer's house, right? Trump has Secret Service and his own security, and why would you authorize lethal force? What do you think, that Trump's security is going to fire on FBI agents or something? Really quite, this is an extreme case where those sorts of boilerplate language shouldn't have been included at all. Moving on to some international news, it was the G7 last week. And you might have seen some clips from there. You might have even seen some clips of Joe Biden apparently during a skydiving demonstration or display where the skydiver fell, didn't fall, but he glided down right in front of the members of the G7, the leaders of the Western governments. And Joe Biden had turned around and was looking at some guy packing up his chute when everybody else was supposed to be facing forward because the photographers wanted to get all the G7 leaders watching the parachutist come down in front of them. So, and then Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister of Italy, had to go get Mr. Biden and lead him back to where the photograph had to happen. In any case, getting back to the story, it's not just Russia. China joins the G7's list of adversaries. While not invited to the group of G7 meeting, China was still a major presence, with the summit's final communique referencing the country 28 times, almost as a malign force. It didn't used to be a malign force, but I'm going to get to that. President Biden was eager to get off the stage of the Group of Seven summit Thursday night, clearly a bit testy after answering some questions about Hunter Biden. But at the end of the news conference with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, he couldn't seem to help jumping in as the Ukrainian leader spoke delicately about China's tightening relationship with Russia. Biden leaned into the microphone and said, by the way, China is not supplying weapons for the war in Ukraine, but the ability to produce those weapons and technology available to do it. So it is, in fact, helping Russia. Well, of course it's helping Russia. You see, we nurtured China, and China was supposed to be on board, but even though they're ideological enemy to the Western style of freedom, particularly individual liberties, they used slave labor. They were supposed to be the manufacturing hub, so they were given a pass on, climate and all these other things. The rules that the other Western countries had to follow, China didn't have to follow. We sent billions of dollars of money over there, of investment, of on and on and on. We built China. We built China's military. And then what did China do? As they most often always have done, even though we put communism in there and allowed, we double-crossed Chiang Kai-shek, because the West has always been behind communism and socialism. I'm not going to go more into that either, but we built China. Nixon and Kissinger went there and said, you know what? We built you. We're the ones that helped Mao win against Chiang Kai-shek. We're the ones that set you up. And now we want to make you even bigger and better and take you out of third world nation status or developing the second world nation as developing nations. and make you a global superpower by bringing in investment, because now that you're set up, the corporations are dying to get manufacturing in here so you can exploit your people. But the Chinese have always been wary of these claims, and what do? Once they've achieved superpower status, they double-cross the West. And now they're setting up their own system outside of SWIFT. They're helping Russia. They're cobbling together alliances with the BRICS nation. They're developing a cryptocurrency. They're trading with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabian oil is now trading in yuan. On and on and on. Anyway, going back to the article, but at the President Biden, next page in the article, throughout the Group 7 summit meeting in Puglia, Italy, China has become a lurking presence as savior of Russia's war machine. In the final communique, as intensifying threat in the South China Sea, as a wayward economic actor. Now they're not a superpower anymore. They're a wayward economic actor, dumping electric cars in Western markets and threatening to withhold critical minerals needed by high-tech industries. 28 references of China in the final communique by the G7. The contrast with China's portrayal just a few years ago is sharp. And here's where the point is. At past summits, the West's biggest economies talked often about teaming with Beijing to fight climate change, which they never did, counterterrorism and nuclear proliferation, while China was never invited into the G7, the way Russia was once. Moscow joined the group in 1997 and was suspended when it annexed Crimea in 2014. Beijing was often described as a partner, supplier, and above all, a superb customer of everything from German cars to French couture. As the time goes on, it is clear that President Xi's objectives for Chinese dominance, not to work with the West, ranging from trade to influencing security issues around the world. But if China's support of Russia, that constituted a new element of this year's summit, and perhaps changed minds in Europe, the subject of Chinese role was barely raised in the last 2 months, and when it was often about the influence of its top leader, Xi Jinping, as a moderating force on President Vladimir Putin, especially when there were fears that Mr. Putin might detonate a nuclear weapon on Ukrainian territory. Well, there it is. Xi's objective is Chinese dominance. You have to understand is that they're ideological. They're a communist country. They are our ideological enemy. They're our military and economic adversary. They want to conquer the West, just like all communist authoritarian regimes, dictatorial regimes. They are against all the freedoms that the West used to espouse. Now you have people turning on John Locke, who's basically the father of individual liberty. Ridiculous. Moving on to the next article from the Sunday New York Times. Western anxiety makes for an unexpected smooth G7 summit. Despite the final communique, political weakness, intractable wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and challenges from Russia and China combined to create solidarity behind American leadership. Even though the American leadership is not Joe Biden because he's dead man walking, it's weekend with Biden. He, as was shown, and just recently at a fundraiser with Obama, he's completely out of it. He doesn't know where the fuck he is at all. So it's behind the West is behind American leadership, but who is leading America? It's not Joe Biden. The story goes on to say the Group of 7 summit that ended Saturday went extraordinarily smoothly, except for Joe Biden turning around facing the other way during photo ops. By the standards of gatherings where the major leaders' powers come together, that was a measure of the anxiety the leaders feel about deteriorating trends in Ukraine, good, and in the Middle East, good, and China, and in their own political futures, mostly. That's where the anxiety lays. There was a dispute over the word abortion in the communique prompted by the host, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy. Of course, because she's the only conservative leader in the G7. And there are going to be more because all the socialists and the globalists, it's really the global postmodern left, are getting cast aside particularly because of the effects or after effects of massive waves of immigration from peoples that are failing to assimilate into the existing cultures. The article goes on to say, President Biden may appear politically vulnerable and uncertain of re-election, but this summit meeting was another example of unchallenged American leadership of the West. And this is what I'm talking about. Why is that? Why are people just blindly following America when America is being led by the blind? First of all, the Democratic policies don't work, either in foreign policy or domestically, economically, what have you. And they're just barreling ahead because the agenda through American leadership was not necessarily American leadership, but we're the strongest country, is trying to push through this global new world order thing where countries become subservient to a supranational body like the UN, but it's basically a corporate-led oligarchy, global oligarchy that nation states will become subservient to. And that's why the whole thing where they're doing things that end sovereignty, like opening borders, and because they want the free movement of peoples around the world. Why? So you can bring in cheap labor, that you don't have to ship everything to China and then ship it back, that you could just bring millions of Chinese slaves into America, or millions of Mexicans or Guatemalans or people that'll work for $2 an hour into your country or into factories so the corporations can use them. This story goes on to say, while Ukraine will not receive an invitation to begin membership talks with NATO, the alliance led by the United States is preparing what Secretary Blinken has called a bridge to membership, a coordinated package of long-term military and financial support for Kiev that some have likened to a diplomatic and military mission. Doesn't that sound nice? It doesn't sound nice. This is another open-ended war. Joe Biden just signed a military-industrial agreement with Ukraine for the next 10 years. So they want an open-ended 30-year war to wear down Russia at the expense of the Ukrainian people. Who the hell wants that? And this is basically for a global agenda. Why? Because they don't like the globalist resistance from the Russian nationalists. So they were hoping that they'd be able to subvert the Russian nationalist fervor when communism ended, and they were just going to be brought in like they were into the G7, which is very, if you know anything about the Hydra and the 7 heads or the 8 heads and one is cut off, but then it grows back, whatever. This is biblical referencing. But Russia was invited in, and then when they refused, they started kicking out NGOs, and they understood they were being subverted like many other ex-Soviet states were undermined through color revolutions like Ukraine and other places, that they realized what was happening. They kicked out all the NGOs and they started becoming more resistant to the Western supranational idea of a new world government, which is a new world order subservient under the corporatocracy. So the Russians didn't want that, and they said, hey, and then they're going to come in and subvert our culture and all these other things. So the Russians didn't want that, and then after Ukraine flipped, after the Maidan revolution, which was actually the second color revolution in Ukraine, the first one happened in 2007, which was the Orange Revolution, and it was only after the Maidan Revolution that Russia took over, had the referendum in Crimea, because they saw what was happening. So it wasn't like it came out of left field, Russia just went into Crimea. It was, as the West went, first the Western banks took over Ukraine, took over all their loans and stuff, And that's when they brought in all the anti-corruption prosecutors, because the Western banks wanted to make sure that their money went where it was supposed to go. And that was where that whole thing went. But then the Western intelligence agencies, the Club of Bern, the CIA, went into eastern Ukraine and started, helping the Ukrainian Nazis, the Azovs, the secret army, the secret police, go in and harass any Russian nationalists that might be living in eastern Ukraine, and setting up listening posts, spy posts, and bases where they could operate intelligence or launch intelligence operations into Russia. Okay. Going back to the stories from the Sunday New York Times. The New York Times reports, we need to unite. Protests against the far right are held across France. A newly formed left-wing coalition called on demonstrators to stop Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party from taking power in the upcoming elections. So where does this seem familiar? I just read you that story about that the American left is organizing rallies and demonstrations and other avenues to stop Donald Trump from taking power. So this isn't something that's specific to Donald Trump. This is something that the global postmodern left is doing around the world, including in France and in Germany and Hungary and in Poland and the Czech Republic and everywhere. They're doing it everywhere. All right, let's just get back to the story. Tens of thousands of demonstrators crowded into French streets on Saturday to denounce the rise of the country's far-right political party and call on fellow citizens to block from taking power the snap parliamentary election set by Emmanuel Macron. The mostly peaceful protests, where have we heard that before, organized by the country's 5 biggest labor unions, which are controlled by the government. I mean, that's socialism, but in any case, were widely supported by human rights associations, activists, artists, and backers of the newly formed left-wing coalition of political parties, the New Popular Front. So it is the political parties launched these protests, just like they do in the United States. Most protesters painted a dark picture of the country's under far-right prime minister, sure. Early polls show a lead for the national rally, which has long called for drastic cut to immigration asylum seekers and the introduction of a system of national preference that would reserve jobs, housing, and hospital treatment for native French people. And why do they say that at the end, hospital treatment? Because they have socialized medicine. So socialized medicine is rationed care. So if you have rationed care and you have to line up and get appointments for things and procedures months and years in advance, they want national preference. So instead of immigrants getting preferential care at the hospital and native peoples having to wait in line behind the immigrants, they want national preference also for jobs and housing. If you didn't know what was happening in Europe, people were being kicked out of their houses and hotels were being taken over to house migrants. Very, very disturbing. So I just wanted to say that the National Rally is actually building a coalition with French Republicans. Now, the French Republicans are not like the Republicans in the United States. The French Republicans are they're centrist. They're sort of on, they're like rhinos in this country. So the National Rally, the far right, is Marine Le Pen's outfit, and whose father started the far right nationalists. But you have to understand that Marine Le Pen is not her father. And her father, I guess, was a Vichy French Nazi or SS, Waffen-SS officer or something like that. But the main driver for far-right policy is immigration. Like France and Sweden and many countries in the EU, their sovereignty has been taken away, except for places like Hungary, which is now being fined €1 million a day for resisting the waves of immigration that the EU put upon member states. All right, let's get back to the news. In the opinion pages, France is on the brink of something terrifying. And this is an opinion piece by Cole Stangler. And I'm just going to get into what I was just describing. The historic triumph of Marine Le Pen's national rally in Sunday's elections for the European Parliament, in which her party took 31% of the vote, more than double that of the president's party, that's Macron's party, threatened this arrangement. Without the dissolution of the National Assembly, and that's the French Parliament, the national rally would have to continue to ramp up pressure on the Republicans, which I just explained were like rhinos in France, aiming to woo conservative voters and punish Republican leaders for their tacit support of the president. That's Macron. The prospect of a lame duck president would only grow. He may genuinely believe voters will deliver him from a French parliamentary majority, hoping his base and old wealthy voters. See, he is a product and he is a politician of the elite. Macron is an ex-banker who is, and the socialists in Europe and the whole social democrats and everything, and just like here, the Democratic Party in the United States are controlled by the corporations and the banks. So he's hoping that his base of old and wealthy voters, the elite, will once again show up in the polls in much greater numbers than the young and working class voters. So you don't want the populace, the majority of working class people, to have any control over Republican government. And Republican, I mean, not a monarchy, an independent country, a sovereign country. The opinion piece goes on to say, in other words, the move could be a last-ditch bid to demystify the party's anti-establishment allure. And this is talking about the national rally. By bringing it into a messy real world of policymaking, probably as wider a part of a wider coalition. It has to be a coalition with the centrists, that's the Republicans. Under this theory, even the prospects of a national rally securing an absolute majority and naming a prime minister of its own, which would be Marine Le Pen, can be seen as kind of a worthy sacrifice. Better to have Prime Minister Jordan Bardella, who is the rising star of the national rally, than President Le Pen. And I don't mind Marine Le Pen. She's not her father, to make it clear, but nationalist fervor is a natural response to globalist fervor, which has seen what they mean by globalism is ending sovereignty of the nation state in which you live. And for the European countries are already subservient to a supranational body, which is the EU. Moving on to the next opinion piece here, January 6th, America's rupture and the strange forgotten power of oblivion. I'm going to go into this really quick. This is by Linda Kinsler. Nearly every week, several more rioters are sentenced for their roles in the insurrection, and the FBI make a new spat of arrests. I have a problem immediately with this because she keeps using the word insurrection. It wasn't an insurrection. The FBI even said so. So how could they be rioters involved in an insurrection? You mean rioters involved in a riot, not an insurrection. Otherwise, they'd be insurrectionists. And you can't be an insurrectionist if you weren't armed. And flagpoles and mace and for some law enforcement officials that participated in the riot, having a handgun with you doesn't make you an insurrectionist. It's because all law enforcement officials are to be armed at all times, even off duty. Article goes on to say, I've heard defense attorneys argue that their clients were there because they believed they needed to protect the Constitution, because their president told them to be here, because their friends asked them to tag along. All those things are true. And also you must realize is that there was over 1 million people there that went to see Trump speak at the Ellipse. Most of the people didn't go to the Capitol. Tens of thousands did, and of those, thousands rioted, and of those, maybe 1,000, 1,500 people went into the Capitol. And then this person's point of the whole opinion piece is what is called acts of oblivion. And I'm just going to go over the history here really quickly. For centuries, legislative acts of oblivion were declared in times of betrayal, war, and tyranny, had usurped and undermined the very foundations of law. And I'm talking particularly about the Democrats, who basically, they cheated And then they surrounded the Capitol with razor wire because they're the ones that launched, it wasn't an armed insurrection, it was a political insurrection. They cheated their way, so it was basically a coup. They cheated their way into the White House, and then when the American people saw it for what it was and tried to stop the certification, not try to overthrow the government, stop certification so a proper investigation could have taken place before certification, this was called insurrection. Anyway, when a household or nation has been torn apart, its citizens pitted against each other, when identifying, investigating, trying to sentencing every single guilty party, threatened to redouble the harm, you have what's called acts of oblivion. And so you wipe your hands of the whole thing and you try to go on. The oldest act of oblivion is usually dated to 403 BC, when the Athenians, having survived the bloody reign of the 30 tyrants, swore to never remember the wrongs of war within the family and civil war that divided Athens. Citizens took an oath of promising not to remember what had occurred, to not remind their neighbors of the evils of the tyranny. The 30 tyrants and their main accomplices were forced to choose between exile and prosecution. Everyone else, even those who had fought alongside the losing. And I don't want to get... live side by side, swore to never again recall the brutal reign of the tyrants. My point being is that the 30 tyrants are the Democrats. It's the Democratic Party and, of course, parts of the Never Trump Republican Party who do not want to return this country to a constitutional republic where individual liberties are enshrined and that everybody has rights. You don't get special rights. And what rights do is give the individual citizen agency. And that's why abortion can't be a right, because abortion is a procedure. So your right to an abortion is not a right. A right is what you, inalienable, endowed by our Creator, have the right of agency. So free speech, freedom of movement, freedom in your possessions and what have you. It's the same reason that housing isn't a right. Housing is not, it's not something that you have when you come out of the womb. It's not inalienable. You're not inalienable. You know, I believe in a social safety net where people should be housed and clothed and fed. I'm not saying that, but I don't think it's a right. You don't have a right to housing or food or an abortion. And then the last opinion piece here today is from Nicholas Kristof. And this is important because Nicholas Kristof is a leading liberal contributor to the New York Times and has been for years, and he's an idiot. If you've ever listened to him, and he's a bleeding heart liberal, and he calls attention to things that need calling attention to. Not saying that. But his explanation of things are idiotic. So going to his opinion piece here, what have liberals done to the West Coast? As Democrats make their case for voters around the country this fall, one challenge is that some of the bluest parts of the country, cities on the West Coast, or states on the West Coast, are a mess. Centrist voters can reasonably ask why put liberals in charge nationally when the places where they have the greatest control are plagued by homelessness, crime, and dysfunction. We are more likely to believe that housing is a human right. As I just said, it's not a human right. Stay with me now. The inability of progressives, particularly in Portland metro area, to deal with the nitty-gritty of governing and get something done is just staggering. And this is from Representative Earl Blumenauer, a Democrat who's been representing and championing Portland for more than half a century, told me people are much more interested in ideology than actual results. How about that? They're not. And the point of this whole opinion piece by Nicholas Kristof was he said, well, hey, liberals are in charge of the Northeast too, and there everything is great. The problem is that the case of Eastern politics, if you knew anything about Eastern politics, it's old money, and people are much more pragmatic and centrist in their political notions. The West is full of ideological fervents, the progressives who say, hey, What if we just get rid of the police? What's going to happen? These progressive pods, the progressives today throw the baby out with the bathwater. They want to undermine establishment governing things that work and just let's try something new. It's all the utopia thing. And the one thing he did state correctly here is they're more interested in pushing ideology, which is far left ideology in the West than they are in the East, and that's why they're having such problems in California, Oregon, and Washington. But it's great that Nicholas Kristof goes ahead and says all this. Did I go almost an hour? I think I'm at 50 minutes. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate everybody who is here. Don't forget to engage the channel, like, subscribe, share the podcast, leave a comment, give me a thumbs up. Remember, you're under attack psychologically, biologically. And stay hip to the trick. I'll see you tomorrow. Respect.
Rudy's Revelation.
This is all a conspiracy. No, you know that it's a conspiracy there.
The New World Order.